welcome everybody to the Pacific Climate Displacement webinar hosted by Displacement Solutions, and thank you to everybody for attending. This meeting is being held in conjunction with our project Peninsula Principles at 10, which commemorates the 10th anniversary of the Peninsula Principles on Climate Displacement within states. We're convening a series of regional webinars all across the world to look into innovative approaches to the question of climate displacement in 2023 and where we should all put our energies, where governments should put their energies, where the UN and other agencies should put their energies, where grassroots groups should place their energies, so that we can better address a problem that is clearly worsening throughout the world and likely to get far, far worse than it is today if current trends continue. Just in the last 24 hours, I'm sure, as you've all seen, there's been this horrible disaster in Libya. More than 10,000 people are likely to have died. I mean, it was not necessarily a climate change event per se, but it was a flooding event, which is also occurring more and more frequently across the world. There's more floods than ever before. There's more storms. Sea level rise is going faster than ever before, and ice melt is also going faster than ever before. So we have a lot of challenges in front of us. There's a lot of attention that has been placed to the question of climate displacement, but until now, the resources, the ingenuity, the policies, the laws that are really needed to address this question for everyone on planet Earth have just not yet been forthcoming. So clearly something more needs to be done at all levels and all corners of the world to address this question. And nowhere is this issue more pressing and more dramatic than in the Pacific. Every country in the world will suffer the negative consequences of climate change, but very few regions will suffer it to the extent that the Pacific is and will. It's an existential question in many parts of the Pacific, quite literally involving the potential disappearance of the physical territory of some of these countries, particularly the atoll nations. So the stakes could not be higher. And so the seriousness and the urgency of this issue could not be higher. So with that very brief introduction, we've been very fortunate to be joined today by 8 people from the region and who are involved with the region very intimately, who have lived and worked there for either their entire lives or many, many decades. And so we'll just go through today 8 interventions by the main participants. And at the end of the meeting, we'll have a wrap-up session and questions and answers to everybody. So if just to remind you again, if you can briefly introduce yourself when you start your talk, we'll just follow the agenda of this meeting. And I will give the floor first to Sabina Kulo.
So yes, just perhaps to start with an introduction, my name is Sabira Coelho, and I work as the program manager for the Pacific Climate Change, Migration and Human Security Program, based at IOM, the International Organization for Migration's office here in Fiji. The PCCMHS program, so that's the short title, is actually a joint UN agency program, but we're also working with, and apologies for all the acronyms, but we're working with SCAP, ILO, OHCHR, the Platform Disaster Displacement, as well as the Pacific Island Farm Sector. So it's very much a joint agency approach. And I guess in speaking to some of the questions or the points that you've raised, Dr. Lecky, I just want to preface my intervention by saying that I'm surrounded by a lot of experts in the region, a lot of experts from academia, but also from the communities and civil society itself. So I think my inputs are very much, relying on the research that have been undertaken in the region and based on some of our consultations with many of the colleagues online. So in responding to some of the questions, I guess maybe just to reiterate, I think the points that you've already made in terms of the key challenges in the region. The PCCMHS program, one of the main, objectives that we were working towards, and we're now in our second phase as of January of this year, was supporting the development of a regional framework to guide governments, but also non-government stakeholders to managing and addressing challenges that are related to climate-related mobility. And the process to do this, as I already mentioned, was basically having a wide-ranging consultative process. So since 2019, we've been having a series of consultations at the national level in 14 Pacific countries. So we covered, I think, about 400 people from different ministries, but also different sectors, including representation from people with disability, LGBTQI community, faith leaders, etc. And then we've also had consultations only in 2 countries, in Papua New Guinea and in Tuvalu, but then through other partners in Fiji, Vanuatu, and again in PNG. And then to say that we also had regional level dialogues, which is intergovernmental, but also the civil society. So all the comments that I make really come from this process. So I guess in terms of the first question, and again, reiterating what you've already raised, I think what we've heard through this process is that the key challenges are, I guess, firstly, ensuring that atoll states have the capacity to remain as nations, and ensuring, I think we've heard a resounding need from countries to actually, or actually communities that, they would like to stay where they are. So this is, I think, the key displacement challenge is really looking at how to avert climate-related displacement. We've also heard about the range of human rights implications that emerges in the context of climate-related displacement. So, of course, the loss of potential livelihoods and how to preserve these, not just for host communities, but relocated communities, and then looking at this in the context of rural to urban movements. We've also heard about the loss of tenure and also insecurity of tenure due to customary land issues in potential new locations, impacts on food security for coastal communities and related livelihood options. In some of the community consultations, we also heard about GBV risks and risks to personal security in general, particularly, again, related to women and other vulnerable groups. We've also heard about, I guess, much more on sort of the ontological security perspective, looking at the challenge that emerges in the context of securing and protecting rights over maritime boundaries. So across the consultations, I think the themes are quite, I guess, similar. I think you've already captured them quite well, but really looking at some of these sort of human security challenges. Another key one just to mention would be that came up again and again is how to communities that are displaced, how do they preserve their identity and culture across time. So maybe just looking at the innovative approaches, I think to say one of the key pieces of work that the PCCMHS partners have been supporting with is looking at facilitating a space for conversation through these consultations, but then also arriving at a regional framework. And so in terms of, and I think colleagues online might have heard this a lot, but just to say that at the end of the first phase of the PCCMHS program last year, we had developed a draft 2.5 on the regional framework. So this draft was overseen by a joint working group, which was an intergovernmental working group co-chaired by the government of Tuvalu and the government of Fiji, but also comprising of 8 other countries. And this draft, regional framework to manage climate-related mobility, was then presented to, I guess it was presented through the Pacific Island Forum process. So the idea is to really make this institutionalized into regional policy. And this went through the Pacific, the Forum Subcommittee on Regional Security. So basically, right now, the next steps towards this are really looking at how this draft can be approved and endorsed by leaders. And of course, this is, I think as agencies, we now take a backseat because it is up to governments in the region to see how to take this forward. But we're hoping that this document exists and hopefully it will be endorsed at the Pacific Leaders meeting this year. In terms of the new strategies that have not been tried, so I think, of course, the Pacific has been facing a lot of critical issues. There's been a lot of advances. I think you mentioned the ICJ advisory opinion, and there's a whole sort of suite of planned relocation policies in Fiji, displacement guidelines. Vanuatu also has displacement guidelines. So there are countries with a lot of policy developments, but I think the new strategies or the areas that we kept hearing that maybe haven't been prevented. And the reason for this is, of course, they're extremely sensitive, and it contradicts a bit with the desire to stay in place, which is, of course, the primary desire of Pacific countries. The new strategies that haven't maybe been tried and tested as much as looking at labor migration as climate change resilience. And the reason for that, of course, is that it needs to be not just a conversation between countries or a conversation between the affected communities, but also bringing on board employer and worker organizations. And so it links into that issue. I see my connection, so I'll just stop my video. And then the other aspects of work that maybe need to be considered a bit more is looking at the development of humanitarian pathways for admission and stay. And they have examples of temporary protection, etc., that have been provided in the context of some, cyclones in the region by Australia and New Zealand. There was a previous question in terms of the money required to address this, which I made some quick bullet points just to share that as part of the technical working group on human mobility, we did do a brief on financing planned relocation. And I think one of the results of this policy brief, one of the sort of summary points of the policy brief was to say that there are, of course, different sources of funding, whether they're international, regional, or bilateral, but these are quite difficult. And for example, the vertical funds, such as the Green Climate Fund or even the adaptation funds, it's very difficult to actually access this to support to support projects that will avert, minimize, and address climate-related displacement. And so the policy brief just makes a lot of recommendations in terms of, how these can be leveraged, but there basically needs to be, changes in the criteria, and there must also be, these funds need to be more accessible, predictable, and sustainable. So as such, they exist, but they're not really, they cannot be leveraged for these sort of innovative projects in this area. So I'll probably stop there, but hopefully that's helpful as a start. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. We'll come back to you later with some questions. Thank you very much, Sabira. So now I give the floor to Joseph Fakuna, currently from Hawaii, but originally from the Solomon Islands. Joseph?
Thank you, Scott. Thanks, everyone. Thanks. I'll focus mainly on the case of the Solomons. Solomon Islands recently introduced a displacement relocation guideline last year, 2022. The guideline, outlines some of the institutional arrangements for dealing with displacement. I mean, for undertaking planned relocation, and the steps that should be followed. But one of the challenges is implementing some of the recommendations or some of the suggested steps, and it's partly because the state depends pretty much on outside support or funding to implement some of these processes, and there's the issue of land tenure arrangements, identifying appropriate land holding arrangements that would be conducive for executing such a planned relocation. And it's partly because of how the nature of the state in a place like Solomon Islands. I mean, I've said it elsewhere, but the state is really a guest in places like Solomon's or Vanuatu or PNG. So with some of these frameworks that are really state-centric, to implement it's an ongoing challenge, because you would need to get buy-in from from the community, from the people on the ground, in order to access land for purposes of resettlement. And I guess one of the approaches maybe is focus more on communities, getting identifying what they want, and what kind of change would make their life much easier. Living in an area that's going to be inundated or impacted by sea level rise, and the kinds of information that people would have access to facilitate their judgment, their decision whether to move or not, or whether to develop adaptation plans of how to address climate change. One of the things that I've also noticed is there's a lot of discussion around climate displacement and migration in the Pacific, but there's no data. There's no data to support, or there's no evidence to support planning in terms of how you address or deal with the interface between climate displacement and migration. So it's not really clear the impact of climate change and migration, because due to lack of data. And just coming back to that, the ICJ, the decision. One of the issues in the Pacific is countries don't really have the capacity to even draft submissions to the ICJ, and even draft submissions or proposals to access funding, for purpose of addressing displacement in the Pacific. So that's I see it as an ongoing issue, the capacity to draft submissions or proposals, or even the capacity to implement some of the frameworks that would comply with with international standards. Thank you. Happy to take any questions.
Oh, thank you very much, Joseph. So, we've worked together in the past on questions related to, for instance, Lau Lagoon, and some other issues in the Solomons. And also, we had a photojournalist that was based in Ontong Java Atoll for several months a few years ago. Do you have any updates on what's going on in Lau Lagoon or Ontong Java or anywhere else, specifically in the Solomons, in terms of people moving?
I mean, there's already informal movements that's already happening without the state. But many of these people end up in informal settlements in Honiara. So that's that's another issue that would also make people continue to be exposed to natural disasters like flooding, or and eventually they would also be displaced. So, the default option for many people is ending up in urban places. But having access to good land, to good housing, it's another issue. So many people end up in informal settlements in Honiara, and that it's much more challenging than their place of origin in let's say Laut Lagoon, for instance, or Ontong Java.
Yeah, because I remember with Ontong Java, and I mean this has certainly been the case in lots of countries, not just island countries, where a piece of land, at least informally, if not officially, was offered to people to move to, which was outright rejected because it would have been impossible to integrate in that area successfully. It would have been impossible to have livelihood. I know, at least anecdotally, land on Malaita was jungle land, mountain land was offered to the people from Ontong Java as a potential resettlement site, which they were not very happy to go to for all sorts of different reasons. So it goes back to that whole question of what exactly correct what you said, the default option for many people, once again, not just in island nations, but Bangladesh or countless others. The only viable option for many people when they do choose to migrate out of necessity is the slum. Popular communities, informal settlements, which are usually, obviously the cheapest and easiest to access places to live. So do you see any movement either in the Solomons or anywhere else of governments or others intervening to find viable land resources for people to establish new settlements that are adequately funded and adequately serviced so that people are not forced to go from wherever they're living now into slum conditions?
I mean, what's for the case of Solomons, what's obvious or what's evident is an increase in informal settlements or expansion of existing informal settlements. So it just goes to show that people are moving, whether it's to do with climate change or other socio-economic reasons, but there is a rural urban migration. And without any data, it's a challenge to see how the impacts of migration and climate change could be addressed at a policy level.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much, Joseph. Always good to see you. I'll give the floor now to Linda Yuan from Kiribati. Linda, it's a great honor to have you here. I give you the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, Kamna Pananimauti and greetings. The frigate is one of our key national icons, the national bird of Kiribati. The song we will hear was written in 1978, many years before we knew anything about global warming, climate change, and sea level rise. The story tells of a bird flying the ocean in search of food for its young. On her return, she finds that her homeland has disappeared beneath the waves. This prophecy from the past reminds us of the uncertain future we face as a country and as a people. We're pleased to present the youth of Kiribati and the song of the frigate. Iau go go rame ngau men sirive te arana Kiribati komenaya ongopana hawanene. 'Ake ara ho, 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 'ake ara ho,
Hakasukai Pomdiriki Kopurake Koe Tunarina Onape Rosiko rake Neinerava Pananoriko ake Amena Ikeraroa Kopurake Iau Koko Ramengau Mensirive Te Arana Kiripasi Komenaya Hongopana Hawanene Hakearaho Aenapuakai Hakasukai Pondiriki Akearaho Aenapuakai Hakasukai Pondiriki Kopurake Koe Tunarina Onape Rosiko rake Neinerava Bananoriko ake Amena Ikeraroa Kopurake Koe Tunarina Onape Rosiko rake Neinerava Pananoriko ake Amena Ikeraroa Memerake Kiribasi Memerake
Thank you. I think from what you have seen, we share the very same feelings that the region, as well as the international community, feels about climate change, rising tides, and displacement solutions, and its impact on every citizen of those countries that are affected. One of the things that we look at is when we talk about innovations, what have we done? What are we going to do when our country, which will be the first of the first to be underwater, what will we do? Will we swim? Will we climb coconut trees? What has been happening to date has been a mass migration from Kiribati to Australia and New Zealand and Canada for employment opportunities, such as aged care, catering, hotels, meat industry. And these are great because we are seeing not just individuals, but individuals moving voluntary for financial benefits for their families. But we are also seeing soft visa schemes that will place these people in the PI system or Pacific Island visa system in those countries, and further confirm them to be citizens of those adopted countries. This has to, it's very good. But the other thing is, you also feel that there is an erosion of some of the major minds that have actually been working in the government to support the system and to support the different ministries and service providers for the citizens here, plus the visitors who have come to visit us. So it's not an easy answer to say it is right or wrong, because these people are taking the opportunity, which, if one would think about it, is a good idea, because it means that they beat the rush. For example, should the predictions are 2050 is supposedly when Kiribati is supposed to be underwater. That may have changed now, but that was when we were involved in the early days. However, even before that happens, the country will not be able to sustain life if there is no fresh water, etc., etc. I look at this issue as a big challenge. If we're going to look at go back to Saki's suggestions for the innovations about displacement, creating floating islands, the original countries. In some parts of Kiribati, especially in Tarawa, we're having to install desalination plants, because most of the island, which is the main seat of the government and the most highly populated, is actually salty, and the groundwater is not safe to drink. So we're having to survive on diesel plus rainwater. So that's one thing that's been implemented mostly by the donors and donor partners to Kiribati, including New Zealand, Australia, and other UN countries. The one wonders how long it will last. The creating the floating islands. Well, there is that idea. There's also that belief, and especially in our traditional belief, that nothing is stronger, nothing can be made by man to be stronger than nature. And so, while it is great that we have that possibility of creating floating islands, it will be good to have the minds and the engineers behind it, so that we have a sustainable system in place, and so that the next, perhaps, displacement for our communities and our countries will not be a middle step to the next step and the next step. It will be good to go from one place to another. Though, if I were to say so myself as an Kiribati, my preference is to remain in my home country, where my heritage and where my culture and my people, where I know the landscape and where I know the system and the culture and the language. land reclamation. That is what we have been strong on. However, there seems to be a shift in the current, and where we used to have protected areas are now exposed, and so we're having to strengthen seawalls after high tides, etc., etc. But because this is the system that we know best and have grown up with it for generations and generations, it is a part of us. To keep that going, because keeping it going means we can still say we are an Ikiribas because we have a piece of land to our name. We have our ancestors who have built on these, and we are therefore proud Ikiribas. The Pacific Unified migration system, that sounds like a good idea. And if the worst comes to the worst, let's have everything prepared. So we do not do things by halves. We plan it and we test it before we involve people and lives. The next one is geopolitical roles, etc., etc. I think it is one of the currently the government of Kiribati does not believe in climate change, and this makes it more challenging to talk about it openly. Though we are blessed to have youth leaders who take us through and talk about climate change, the issues that they may face as future leaders, and their roles. Things to look out for. I think one of the things that we need to do, and it does not matter, it'll be a blessing if we do not have displacement. But if it does, it will be good to get our houses in order. Get everything prepared. For example, what do we need to preserve? What are the cultural cultures that we want to transport to another country? What are those that we prefer they stay home with Kiribati? There's also things like our traditional way of life. How do we remember it? How do we keep our language going? How do we preserve all these and be proud of Kiribati in our new adopted home, where we are contributing members of that new community and not become a drain on the government system. I think I'll stop with that, but thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Oh, thank you very much, Linda. And I think the difficult technological connection we just had is indicative of many of the challenges facing all of the Pacific, but Kiribati in particular. I wonder, about 10 or 15 years ago, the previous government, headed by Anote Tong, purchased land in Fiji, in Vanuatu, several thousand acres. Has there been anything happening on that front in recent years? Any movement from the Fijian side or from the Kiribati side regarding that land? That might be interesting for people to hear about.
All right. Today we have the second round of the by-election of MP for South Barrow. One of the platform that is building on is using the Fiji purchased land for the people of Tarawa who have been displaced internally by government buildings to run and establish a government and provide workforce housing for the people. So that's one thing that's been discussed as recently as last night. The other, of course, is that it's going to be used as a source of food security, whereby they would plant food and transport it to Tarawa to feed the masses. Those are the two things that I've heard. There may be others, but those are the ones that I'm up to date with.
Okay, thank you very much. Very interesting. Well, thank you very much, Linda, for that analysis of the situation affecting your wonderful country, which I've had the pleasure to visit several times, and I hope to come back again soon. I'm not sure if Daniel's there yet. Does anybody know? And Ursula, is Ursula there yet? Neither. Okay. So then we're going to move now to Nick McClellan, who will enlighten us on various matters. Nick, I give the floor to you.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you very much for the invitation to join this discussion. My name's Nick McClellan. I'm speaking to you from the land of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people in Naarm, Melbourne. I work as a journalist. I'm a correspondent for Islands Business Magazine, which is published in Fiji as a regional news and current affairs magazine. But over many years, I've been involved in work around communities affected by climate change, and particularly by nuclear testing. And what I wanted to contribute today was to reflect a bit on how, when we debate climate displacement, we can learn from the history of uprooted peoples in the Pacific who've gone before and who have lived apart from their homelands for decades. Because this is the future for many communities, that this will not be a temporary relocation. It may be decades long. And there is lived experience across the Pacific of people who have relocated. You think of the Banabans who were relocated from their island because of phosphate mining, people from Rumbi who live on Rumbi and Kura, Kiribati, Tuvalu people replaced in the past. Gilbertese labourers relocated to the Solomon Islands. Some years ago, after a tsunami hit Gizo in the Solomon Islands, I went to meet with communities affected by that natural disaster and found the difference between people of Solomon Islands heritage who had clan and land to respond to the disaster and people of Gilbertese heritage who'd been living in Gizo for decades yet had no land rights and no Indigenous cultural rights. And the difference between people who were living intermingled in the community in terms of their access to place and movement after a disaster. What I wanted to flag in the short time available is about the long-term experience of people displaced by nuclear testing, because I think there are some significant lessons that need to be documented, studied and shared as people look at climate displacement, simply because there are some pretty sharp and, in fact, worrying lessons from that. You know, the United States conducted 67 atomic and hydrogen bomb tests in the Marshall Islands in the 1940s and 1950s. And that has left significant impacts for people displaced from particularly Bikini, Eniwetok, but also islands that were badly irradiated during the 1954 Bravo test, the largest test ever conducted by the United States. And, you know, in 1946, Marshallese were asked to relocate from Bikini for the good of humanity and to prevent all future wars. So that displacement of people affected not only those in the 1940s, but also those affected after the 1954 Bravo test. And some years ago, I was in the Marshall Islands interviewing people from Rongelap Atoll, one of the islands and atolls most badly affected by the Bravo test. This is the late Mrs. Lemnio Arbon and Mrs. Rinok Riklon. And they were talking about their role as elders in the community who've been displaced. After the 54 test, some people moved back to Rongelap in 1957 because of ongoing contamination, the way they couldn't use the land for food, for gardening and so on. They were relocated by the Greenpeace vessel Rainbow Warrior in 1985, just before the Greenpeace boat was blown up by French terrorists. And so people have been living in exile since the mid-1980s. And when I spoke to Mrs. Arbon, she said, and I quote, "We're still living in exile from our homeland like a coconut floating in the sea. The US has to live up to their responsibility and make sure that our grandchildren and children are cared for." So one of the things I think is really worth thinking about is, how do elderly people respond to the exile, feeling responsibility for younger children? And I think there's scope for further research and documentation from past experience to flag issues that elders in the community, be they customary elders, chiefs, religious elders and others, what sort of responsibilities will they have for future generations when displaced by the homeland? So, for example, in the Marshall Islands, children from Bikini live on Edget Island in the capital Majuro, and there's a lot of work done to educate people about the nuclear heritage. So young children today wear the T-shirt with the symbol, the mushroom cloud symbol, as a way of connecting children in exile in Egypt to their original home, which is in many parts uninhabitable because of ongoing contamination. And there's a national day where school children are, involved in a whole range of community education processes to explain the heritage of why they are displaced and how it was caused and what can be done. And I think it's really important because children have insights about what displacement means for them that's different to adults. And I think there's scope for, documenting that psychologically, culturally, what those sorts of things mean, and what do children miss from not being in their own place. Another problem is the experience of what I call nuclear sacrifice zones, environmental sacrifice zones. And as Linda has just talked about, there are problems where atolls will be difficult to live on because of the salination of water, because of contaminants, because of damage to agriculture. So long before the image of people going glug, glug, glug under the waves, which I think is a very dangerous image, there are practical questions about whether you can live. This is the Runit Dome, massive concrete dome placed on an island in Eniwetok Atoll, containing contaminated materials. There's a lot of concern that that's leaching radioactive isotopes in the marine environment. And I think you can think about parallels with current climate displacement in terms of the salination of agricultural areas, river deltas in places like Fiji, the impact of salination on agriculture, the destruction of coral reef ecosystems. These environmental sacrifice zones pose the question, do you allocate resources to clean them up and care for them, or is that throwing money away? And I think there's some interesting debates about asking the responsible parties, i.e. the Northern Hemisphere powers that have created this problem, when allocating resources, how much should go into clean up and reparation of the environment compared to care for affected communities. That also can create significant dilemmas and divisions within communities. And I think the experience of Marshallese displaced by nuclear testing poses some significant lived experience that climate-displaced communities can look at. Just recently, there's been reporting in the New York Times about how changes by the US government over the management of trust funds for affected people from Bikini has led to mismanagement, some alleged corruption of resources that were allocated to displaced communities. So I think there's a whole area about the governance and management of trust funds. Linda raised people earlier in the discussion raised questions of accessibility, predictability, sustainability of funding, all of which are crucial. But I think the governance of funds allocated for people and how grassroots people can determine the priority of the funding poses some important lessons from the past that will be, I think, significant for the future. Despite all of this gloom and doom, there is, in fact, some positive work being done in the Marshalls about the legacies of the past being linked to the challenges of the present. One of those is that through the UN Framework on Climate Change, Marshall Islands has been developing its national adaptation plans to submit through the Conference of the Parties and UN processes. There's been a committee established to do extensive community consultations around what sort of adaptation do people want, given that low-lying atolls in the Marshalls are threatened by all the adverse effects of climate change, as with Kiribati, Tokelau, many other small places. But Marshalls uniquely is trying to be one of the first national adaptation plans, and here I'm quoting climate envoy Kathy Jetmel-Kitchener, who I interviewed recently on this question, and she's talking about the need to take into consideration the nuclear legacy and how the nuclear legacy can inform how we plan for climate change action. So here's a concrete example where using contemporary processes around climate policy and the need for adaptation, and I think in the future, loss and damage work as well. This issue is going to come up around loss and damage as well as around adaptation. There are lessons from the past that are country-specific, but may have resonance in other parts of the region that can inform the contemporary work. And I think the Marshall Islands, in attempting to make the climate nuclear nexus about displacement, is a really significant example where a younger generation, learning from the trauma of their elders who've been displaced for decades, are looking at how to draw on that legacy and history of trauma to inform contemporary policy through this area. And I think this is really significant. Some years ago, I did some work with UNICEF on children and climate change and looking at how young people react to this potential. We talk a lot about what will happen with 2030 or 2050 for kids of this age. That's their life. And thinking about how the experience of elders impacts on them. We did a workshop and the kids drew the things that they liked about Tuvalu, about Kiribati. And when you look at the things there, the coconut trees, the fish, the lagoon, the sun, these are the very things that are being transformed around them. And I think that question, therefore, of drawing on the lived experience of elders who've been through this from other causes, labour mobility displacement, nuclear displacement, mining displacement, uprootedness, it's a phenomenon around the region. And I think climate policymakers and researchers, academics, can do more detailed documentation, not just looking at the past, but how that informs contemporary policy. I'll stop there and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Nick. Always good to hear your thoughts and insights on the region, and very good, of course, for everyone to be reminded of the legacy of nuclear testing in that region, which most people, most places barely know about anymore. And yet it lingers on and on and on as it always was predicted to do. And I think it's a good reminder too, just generally speaking about the Pacific region and how it's been treated by the major powers in the world for the last, pretty much since the age of so-called discovery began in the 1700s. The Pacific has always been treated as a second-class region, so to speak, and continues very much to this day. And let us not forget that the climate consequences that region is undergoing right now, aside from the nuclear consequences, stem primarily from a handful of very wealthy countries who made a decision long ago to have things called colonies and burn things called oil and coal that had certain consequences on one region of the world far more than any other. And so it does raise that eternal question, the controversial one, but nonetheless the vital one of who's going to pay for all of this. The whole loss and damage question, the whole reparations/compensation question, and how we need to, better address that issue within the broader context of tackling all of the issues that have been raised thus far, including those, of course, by Linda, who made it very, very clear that at even the most basic level, having access to clean and plentiful drinking water is already a contemporary challenge, not just in Kiribati, but in many of the countries, particularly the atoll nations. And that whole dilemma of should I stay or should I go is something that every single family in every country in the region has already begun to grapple with. They've already had that discussion around the dinner table many, many times. And it just raises such a plethora of questions when it comes to pursuing the best possible strategic and policy approaches to these questions in the region. So Nick, we'll come back to you at the end, but thank you very much again. Always good to hear from you. So now I think we'll give the floor to Clara.
Thanks, Scott. Okay, so just a brief introduction. I'm Clara Railoa, and I currently work at the University of Fiji as a project manager for a USA Pacific American Fund grant that's working on aquaculture farms in the Western Division. I'm also a researcher at the university, primarily focused on climate change and adaptation. And so we've also worked on, I think, 2 papers on relocation and place attachment. I'll get right on to my presentation. I just made a few brief notes to address the questions that were put forward to us. I think that is on regional climate displacement in the context of the Pacific and in Fiji. So I will also be looking at key measures taken by the Fijian government, challenges and successes, and our priorities for the next few years. So our key displacement challenges in the region. Fiji, like many other vulnerable small island developing states, has been facing the threat of climate change impacts. So we've been facing sea level rise. We've had extreme weather events. I think the most recent in Fiji was Cyclone Winston in 2016. So in most cases, it's been sea level rise that has led to a lot of coastal erosion, a lot of saltwater intrusion, making most of the land, especially on the coastal areas, not suitable. So there are no longer arable land that's available for agriculture, essentially taking away the livelihoods of most of these coastal communities. So a lot of these extreme weather events have led to climate-induced relocations in Fiji. And so the Fijian government has identified 48 villages that require partial relocation, either partial or full relocation. So the very first being that of Unindangoloa village, that was in 2012. And more recently in 2020, we have the 7th village to be relocated, which was Nariposo on the island of Otago. Well, if I have to talk about the measures that have been taken by the Fijian government, so we had quite a few lessons learned from the relocation of Unindangoloa in 2012. And it was following this relocation that the Fijian government acknowledged the importance of planned relocation as a last resort to climate change impacts. Because I think we realized the importance of these ad hoc relocations and the impact that it has on these communities, especially when you when the only thing that you're looking at is moving them away from the physical danger that you can see before you. I think, well, this community was a coastal village, and they had to be moved away from this area, from the initial site, which was being inundated with salt water daily. So there were other considerations such as the psychological and also the social implications of moving away from your initial site, because we have a lot of cultural attachment and ties to our land. These were things that were not taken into consideration during this first move, and the impacts were only made aware maybe to the government after the relocation was conducted. And so as a result of this, the Fiji government decided to, so we've come about with a standard operating procedure, or the SOP, for planned relocation in Fiji. This came about to support the successful operationalization of our planned relocation guidelines. This became publicly available in March of this year. So the SOP is quite comprehensive in the fact that it has these mandatory processes, which I think is very important when you're talking about relocation for communities. So they base a lot of this on consensus-based decision-making. They've also have systems for grievance to redress grievances raised by the community. So there's a lot of focus as well on ensuring that there's a lot of community consultation first off, before the relocation process takes place. There's also the important thing is that relocation is only seen as something that's a last resort. That is only after exhausting all other adaptation measures. So usually when a community makes a request to the government to relocate, there is a system in place to assess the risks of moving this community before they can be earmarked for relocation. The important thing I think that this SOP also ensures is that they look at sustainability once a community moves. I think, like Joe mentioned, as in the case of the Solomons, there are a lot of people that move into slum-like conditions, and that's something that the Fiji government does not want to happen to people that are being relocated. So I think that is a real success in the implementation of this SOP, is that making sure that people who move to a place where they can still continue their livelihood, that they're still able to work, they still have access to important resources such as health care and schools, that they're easily accessible to all of these important services. We do not want people basically moving to something that's much worse than the situation that they were in already. If I had to speak about challenges that we've met when trying to relocate these communities, I guess the main thing would be in community relocations, they can be met with resistance, primarily due to our cultural and societal ties to our land. So that's always an important consideration when you're thinking about moving these communities. There may be difficulties in ensuring proper compensation and support for these displaced communities. So I think that fall back on Joe's example of the issues that they faced in the Solomons. So that is one of the key challenges that we face when we're trying to relocate these communities. There's also, like I mentioned, the consideration of psychological or social impacts of relocation. It still remains unclear. So when we're speaking about trying to monitor and evaluate the relocation post relocation, so there are things that the physical aspects are measurable, but there are things that we cannot measure. So how do we take those intangible losses into account? And well, yes. So I think the important thing is that when we're planning for such relocations, our governments need to consider factors such as safety and well-being of affected communities, the issue of cultural heritage and our ties to our land, the availability of infrastructure and services in those areas that they're relocating to. Well, in addition to this, it's also important to ensure that relocated communities can adjust to their new source of livelihood, because I think in the context of Fiji, if we're saying that we're moving all these communities that were primarily focused on livelihood that's based off the sea, moving them further inland loses their access to the sea, and so they essentially have to look for a new source of livelihood. But I guess I can refer to the case of Bonitongoloa as a success story. The fact that they weren't able to access the old site, they were able to set up aquaculture farms there. So that was a good thing and something that ensured their food security and a source of livelihood at the new location. So also mentioning again, community engagement is essential, because you need to do this to ensure a successful transition, and of course to minimize any disruptions along the way. And then when you're thinking about, so when I speak about monitoring and evaluation of the relocation process, I think to mention that the SOP also has a specific task force that is tasked with the responsibility of monitoring and evaluating the relocations. So I think that's a particularly good thing, and something that I'm especially proud of with the Fijian government for making sure that these things are in place. So it's something that we hope in the long term will help secure the livelihoods of these families that are relocating, because currently we have identified 48, but these numbers will grow because of course the impacts of climate change will just worsen over time. But we are hoping that our situation does not become as worse as how it is in Kiribati and our other atoll neighboring nations. It's always really sad to hear your stories. Recently in March, we had visited Kiribati, and I'd say watching Linda's video, it brings back memories of how life back in Kiribati really is. It really is devastating to see people living in those conditions. I hope that when we're speaking about relocation, that these that things are taken into consideration. And also, I think one particular question that you guys had raised was the viability of the Pacific-wide migration. So I think the same policies or the same policy that we have in place in our relocation guideline and in our SOP, I think we could use several of those to put into place for this Pacific-wide migration scheme, if it comes into place, because I think, like Linda mentioned, it's really important to plan ahead. We cannot do things in halves. We cannot be making these moves, relocating entire nations of people without planning and without making sure that that we have proper structures in place to make sure that everyone settles in and is ensured a livelihood in their new homes. So I guess, yeah, I think that's it from my end. If I'm going to be speaking about climate displacement, yeah, and in the context of Fiji. So, yeah, thanks. Over to you, Scott.
Thank you very much, Clara. That was really interesting. And I think of all the many good things you said, the statement you made that the government officially does not want people to move to areas which are worse than the areas they were living in before is a simple and obvious policy we would hope in the world, but it's certainly not widespread. And so I think governments across the world can look to that policy and that perspective and hopefully do what's necessary to ensure that reality comes true for people everywhere, not just in Fiji, but across the world. because we very much take a human rights perspective to this entire question of climate displacement, and we constantly urge governments everywhere to ensure that people who are affected in this way are treated as rights holders, as they are in law, and that they have the right policies and laws in place to ensure that everyone everywhere can have their housing, land, and property rights met as a baseline. So thank you very much for that. It was really interesting to hear all the advancements that have taken place in Fiji in recent years. And we'll come back to you at the end. And then I guess finally, if Daniel and Ursula are not here yet, I'll give the floor to Volker to speak about his experiences in the Carteret Islands, Bougainville, and other peacemaking initiatives across the world. So Volker, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Scott, for having me. So my name is Volker Böge. I'm a senior research fellow with the Toda Peace Institute in charge of Toda's work stream on climate change, conflict, and peace in the Pacific. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which I'm speaking today here in Brisbane in Meanjin. It's the Jagera and Turrbal people, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and acknowledge that this is Aboriginal land, was always Aboriginal land, and will always be Aboriginal land. So I think it has become very clear that the people in the Pacific are stuck or caught between the strong desire to stay where they live on their homelands and the need for a plan B in case this is not possible any longer because of the effects of climate change. And let me stress what Kirela just had said about the deep connection of Pacific Island people to their land. So in Pacific worldviews, land, people, sea, the ancestors are closely interconnected. So in Fiji, you have the term Vanua, or in Tuvalu, you have the term Whenua, which means both people and land. So the people are an extension of the land, and the land is an extension of the people. And when I talk to people from the Pacific, often they talk about the custom of burying the umbilical cord of the newborn in the place where this child was born, to express this connection between people and land. So in the Pacific context, one cannot think of land merely as a physical location or as an economic asset or something that can be bought and sold, but one has to take into account this spiritual dimension. And I think this spiritual dimension is often marginalized or underestimated from a Western enlightened approach, but it is of major importance in the Pacific. On the other hand, at the same time, you also have the history and tradition of mobility in the Pacific. So the history of the Pacific canoe, the Pacific voyagers, and this connection to land and this kind of mobility are not exclusive, but they are not contradictory. In Pacific understandings of life, they go together. They are two complementary sides of Pacific identity, as long as the mobility is voluntary. The problem arises when it's forced, when you have displacement, when you have a planned relocation because a site becomes uninhabitable. But when we look at inhabitability or uninhabitability, one again has to take into account that this is not just something objective and where you only have the physical criteria, but it also has other non-material dimensions. And often it's outsiders who come in and try to tell the people whether their place is inhabitable or uninhabitable. And this does not go down well with the people in a village in the Pacific. And this is why I think one has to look also much closer on this issue of voluntary immobility. So Kerala just mentioned it. So out of these 48 people, 48 villages in Fiji that by the government have been allocated for planned relocation, there are villages where people say, we do not want to move because of our responsibilities for the ancestors, for the sacred sites, for the burial grounds of our ancestors. So for these people, it is really, really difficult to acknowledge the need to move because of their spiritual connection to place. And this is why it often has been said that burial sites, graveyards are the biggest obstacle to relocation in the Pacific. And often you hear older people saying they would rather die than move. All the more so, and Kerala and Joe and others have mentioned this. Often the relocation sites are perceived as being uninhabitable by those who have to move, be it because there are conflicts with the recipient communities. So I've worked with Ursula on the Carteret's case a couple of years ago. And it's very difficult because in the Pacific there is no empty land. So land is occupied by people, even if there are not formal titles to land. There is no empty space. So you have to find arrangements with recipient communities. In the Carteret case, it's a pity that Ursula is not here. You have the situation that the Carteret Islanders could move to church land, which had been alienated before. But this land is by far not enough, so you have to negotiate access to land with neighboring communities. And negotiating access to land is difficult. So there are conflicts over land, which even have led to relocation of people who had already moved because of the conflicts with the recipient communities. And Joe mentioned the situation in the informal settlements in Honiara, and you can also talk about informal settlements in Suva or in the other few urban centers in the Pacific, where people are often worse off, Scott just mentioned it, than where they came from, and where they again are exposed to the detrimental effects of climate change, because these informal settlements are often in riverbeds or in coastal areas that are particularly exposed to the effects of climate change. And there are all sorts of issues in these informal settlements. So I think when we look into the future, we have to look much more into this movement into informal settlements, and we have to look much closer into this issue of voluntary immobility. It's not only about trapped populations, but also about populations that do not want to move. So I think we have to acknowledge the deep spiritual connection between land and people in Pacific communities. But on the other hand, we can also build on the history and culture of Pacific mobility. And when I talked about the conflicts between communities, there are also traditional ways of getting access to customary hold land. Joe can talk about it, about kinship relationships, relationships via trade, via exchange of gifts and so forth. It's possible. And I think this is why we have to look beyond the institutions of the state. Joe said the state in many Pacific Island countries is just a guest in the communities. So everyday governance, and also governance with regard to the environment, comes from the chiefs, from the elders, from other traditional authorities. And so you have to include these traditional authorities in any planning for displacement and relocation. Not to forget the churches. State institutions are mostly in the urban centers and hardly can be found in the villages, but the churches are everywhere. So I think it's very important to have the churches included. One has to accept that it's the communities who have to define whether their site has become uninhabitable or not, and decide about the sites that are suitable for relocation. And this means not only to address the technical, economic, political, legal aspects of relocation, but also the cultural and spiritual aspects. So Kirilla just talked about the intangible dimensions, the intangible needs. And there's this debate about non-economic loss and damage that has to be taken into account in this context. So I think the main question is how to maintain the identity of the people who have to relocate under conditions of relocation when the option to go home is lost. And Nick gave some examples, some negative examples of relocation in the Pacific, but there are also positive examples. So the Gilbertese and the Solomon Islands, I think, have a very hard time, but the Banabans on Rabi have managed to accommodate to the new situation. So how to reconstruct place-based, land-based identity under conditions of displacement. Just as an aside, or just before I close, coming back to the Kiribati government purchasing land on Vanuatu in Fiji, which now is presented as, for food security. By Anotetong, it was presented as an option for relocation. One has to take into account that people are sitting on this land today. And these are people who are the descendants of Solomon Islanders who had been blackbirded and taken to Fiji to work on the sugarcane plantations there. This land was land owned by the Anglican Church, which sold it to the Kiribati government. The Fiji government said, yes, that's a good thing. We are happy to welcome our brothers and sisters from Kiribati who suffer from climate change. But you also have these people who are already living there, these descendants of the blackbirders, and you have the Itauke traditional landowners who were the owners of the land before it was taken over by the Anglican Church. And I think this is a very good example about the multi-scalar, complex situation of relocation in the Pacific. You have two governments. You have traditional owners, you have the church, you have people who settle there because they don't have any legal formal title, but they have lived there for generations. And how to deal with situations like that. And you can't do it if you only involve the state, if you only look at the material, physical side. You also have to include these non-tangible elements. You have to include spirituality. You have to include the traditional leaders and so forth. Thank you.
wow, you really covered a lot of issues there, and very, very articulately. And one of the ones I think we should also, spend a bit more time discussing is this whole question of voluntary immobility, as you called it. And this raises the broader issue in terms of response to the whole question of basically on-site adaptation as a strategy to assist people in vulnerable areas who wish to stay. Because I think, it's no accident that even in this modern world where mobility and migration has perhaps never been easier in the last century, at least, before the whole institution of passports were put into place, it's only 3 or 4% of the world's population that lives outside of the country of their birth. It's a very rare thing to this very day. And so it's a lot to assume that many Pacific Islanders who have a particular connection to their land, whereby human and land, as you so articulately put it, cannot be divorced from one another. They're essentially one and the same. They need to be viewed conceptually as that. To expect them to voluntarily move from either one island to another, or even within the same country, let alone to another country, is presuming a lot that one cannot really legitimately presume. And I think one of the most commonly heard phrases in the Pacific, really, when you start talking about questions of mobility and migration, is, if I move from my land, I will never, ever be on my land again. I will always be on someone else's land. And if I'm on someone else's land, my status as a human being is fundamentally different than it would have otherwise been. And it cannot physically really ever be altered. There's variations to that, but that in essence is one of the challenges that we face with the whole question of looking at it through the lens of mobility and migration. But it raises this issue of adaptation in place. And certainly on the work that we have done on climate displacement all across the world, in highly urbanized, very overcrowded, Bangladesh or whatever, Panama or Colombia or a whole range of other countries, the question of adaptation in place is one that is something definitely preferred by people if it is physically possible. And I think that's an area that we really need to explore a lot more. Yes, it's vital that people are able to migrate or move if they have no other local alternative. But at the same time, it's clear that there are on-site, very small steps in some cases that can be taken to, the obvious example, the cheapest in Myanmar, where we've worked a lot on this issue as well. If the state or some entity is able to provide materials that it would enable people to raise the level of their house just 3 meters on stilts, yes, it's not a permanent solution that will last hundreds of years, but it will allow them to stay in that spot for at least 10 more years or 20 more years or maybe longer, and certainly give them time to figure out other deeper adaptation strategies that they may wish to pursue. So I think that's just something to, put on the agenda, that, it's asking a huge amount, as all of the people from the islands have said here today. And as I've heard many, many times before, if given the opportunity, most people in most places will not move, and they don't want to move, and because they're leaving so much behind. And to reestablish that somewhere else, and this is the case with refugees and IDPs everywhere as well, not counting climate displaced people. How do you move an entire culture from place A to place B? It's not very easy to do, let alone the community around it, that non-definable essence of community. You can't just transfer 100 people from place A to place B and expect it to be exactly the same as it was before. You lose something in that process. And yet, as Volker said so clearly, people are deeply attached to the land, but at the same time, there is this kind of eternal issue of movement and mobility for all sorts of different reasons. So I think, part of the missing link, then that's really what we're after here. Where do we go next? What's the missing link? I think part of it is this kind of the vision, what's the vision that people of the Pacific have for their region? What could it possibly look like in an ideal world in the next 10, 20, 50, 100 years? And put that vision together and try to find sort of, democratic very large majority support for what that vision actually looks like. And that vision might be open migration pathways between all the countries. It might be new ways of promoting investment that could lead to higher standards of living. It might be infrastructure development that would allow people to stay longer in places where they might flee from without that sort of assistance. And there's a whole range of aspects that could be looked at. And ultimately, too, how do we have a Pacific that actually looks what people outside of the Pacific think of when they think of the Pacific? Because, people that live there and people that, like us, who have been there a lot and who know people from there, the situation facing a lot of people is really difficult, to be perfectly frank. It is not all palm trees and beautiful white sand beaches and, margaritas and pina coladas on the coastline for most people living there. For some people who visit, yes, but for the people, the majority of people that live there, life can be difficult and can be challenging. And, we need to sort of have this consolidated vision amongst the islanders themselves of what type of region they want to build, and then try to get the support that has not been there historically. The Pacific has been treated as a place of exploitation, and it remains such today. I mean, we cannot, skirt around the very basic fact that much of the Pacific is still a colony, officially, and all of it unofficially, in one way, shape, or form, are still colonies. They're essentially places of extraction by Western powers and the corporations that are beholden to the governments in those places. And we just can't ignore that simple fact. And when we weave in the geopolitical considerations of that region now, which have taken on a significance far greater than they have in the post-war period, you can see that there's a very clear struggle between two of the dominant entities in the world over influence and sphere of control in the region. And that cannot be ignored. We have to acknowledge that and try to, as with all things, turn a bad thing into something good. If we can, how can we use, as supporters of the Pacific and people that are in the Pacific, how can we use that geopolitical rivalry in a way that would benefit the people of the Pacific rather than break them off into certain camps, struggling and fighting against one another? So I think we need to really think about that. And I'm also reminded of one of the things that Nick said regarding governance of trust funds and things of that nature. I mean, let's not forget, too, that transparency is a vital issue in all regions of the world, including the Pacific, and that I think the more that there is an assurance by official institutions and others when it comes to questions of financing and things of that nature, that the money will be spent as it was promised to be spent, that it will be overseen properly, that it will be accounted for. All of those basic business practices really need to be in place. And if you can put those in place and ensure that they will be taken seriously, I believe that, to the extent that funds are sought outside of the region, they will be far more likely, to be given. So at the end of the day, we can't ignore the geopolitics. We can't ignore the local cultural practices and the way in which people live. We can't ignore the challenges of migration and the challenges of people moving into slum-like conditions as exist in so many places in the Pacific, and a whole range of other matters. So, everybody's contributions today are greatly welcomed in terms of raising, all of the issues that need to be looked at as we go further. And hopefully things like the upcoming COP meetings, advancements on loss and damage, which are clearly advancing over and above where they were at for the last 27 meetings of the COP. And the cases that are pending at the International Court of Justice, the Taitioa case, of course, in the famous refugee case that started in New Zealand involving Kiribati. Other cases like that are emerging. In fact, we at Displacement Solutions are currently now exploring litigation possibilities on cases relating to housing, land, and property rights in the world. We haven't made our minds up yet exactly precisely where and when, but we are definitely looking into this question. And Viraj here, who's now sitting in Berlin at the moment, in the middle of the night, showing his dedication to the cause, is doing a lot of research on this whole question of where we're at globally in terms of litigation and where we can go next in order to get sort of precedent-setting cases that really put the onus on government and society to ensure just this little sliver, but a vital one, of that every single person affected by climate displacement has a decent place to live in the process, and what it actually takes, to make that a reality. I should also say one of our recent reports, two of them, in fact, deal specifically with the need for all governments everywhere, realizing, of course, the limitations of government in the Pacific in many ways, but nonetheless, at the most fundamental and basic level, to have in place institutions that are specifically entrusted with managing this whole question of climate displacement and making sure that nobody ever falls through the cracks. So they would be entrusted with looking at land questions, at housing conditions, at housing investment, at protection of tenants, and protection of squatters, at relocation questions, all of these things in a way that's managed and overseen democratically by the people. So those are just some of the key issues that I think emerged today. So would anybody else like to add anything, to ask questions of the other participants? And if you would, just let me know right now and we'll move to that. Just raise your hand or make an intervention. If nobody has any questions, then I think we'll just end it there then. So, and just thank everybody again for coming. I hope it was useful and of interest to everyone. I hope you all stay in touch with one another too, and because that's the way we really will push things forward, if we all continue to stay in touch, work together when and if we can, and keep the world from forgetting about the Pacific. It's in our worlds here at this particular meeting, it may be frequently on our minds, but very often it isn't in the corridors of power, except for in the wrong way. So let's keep it on the agenda in the right way, and make sure that the future for the people of the Pacific and the beautiful islands that they live on and occupy is a bright one, and not the dismal one that we so often hear about. So thank you again, everybody. And let's all stay in touch, and thanks for coming. Thank you very much.